It was a bitterly cold evening, and the wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying the sharp bite of winter with it. Emily shivered as she stood under the dim, flickering street lamp, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. The streets were empty, and the sound of her boots clicking on the pavement seemed to echo unnaturally. After a long day of work, all she wanted was to get home, curl up with a warm blanket, and escape from the world. She pulled out her phone, opened the rideshare app, and requested a cab. The wait time showed 5 minutes, and she groaned. Felt like an eternity in the cold. Emily checked the street in both directions, but there were no signs of life. No cars, no people, nothing. The whole city seemed asleep, save for her. Finally, the faint glow of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they neared. A sleek, black cab rolled up to the curb, and the rear passenger window slid down. "Need a ride?" the driver asked, his voice gravelly but polite. Emily quickly opened the door and slid inside. The warmth of the car was a welcome change from the icy night. She buckled her seatbelt and gave the driver her address. He nodded, glancing at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Even though it was night, she found it odd but didn't question it. Maybe he had sensitive eyes or a condition that required it. The driver pulled away from the curb, and they began their journey through the quiet, darkened streets. Emily rested her head against the window, her eyes half closed, watching the streetlights pass by in a blur. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic bump of the tires on the road began to lull her into a state of near sleep. Minutes passed, and Emily noticed something strange. The streets outside the window seemed unfamiliar. She frowned and sat up straighter, trying to get her bearings. "This doesn't look like the way home," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The driver didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Taking a shortcut," he said, his voice low and gravelly again. "Don't worry, we'll be there soon." Emily's unease deepened. She had lived in this neighborhood for years and knew the streets like the back of her hand. There were no shortcuts she didn't know about. She glanced at her phone, intending to check the GPS, but the screen was dead. The battery had drained completely without her noticing. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice firmer now. "This really doesn't seem right." The driver didn't answer this time. His silence hung in the air like a thick fog, and Emily's heart began to race. She looked out the window again. The streets had become darker, more desolate. There were no houses, no familiar landmarks, just endless stretches of road illuminated by dim streetlights that flickered ominously. "Stop the car," Emily demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "I want to get out." The driver continued without a word, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. Panic surged through her. Emily reached for the door handle, but the lock wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. "Let me out," she shouted, pounding on the glass. "Let me out now." Finally, the driver spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're almost there." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She looked around frantically, searching for something, anything that could help her. But there was nothing. The car sped through the eerie, deserted streets as if the city itself had vanished. After what felt like an eternity, the cab finally slowed and turned onto a narrow, winding road that led to a secluded area. The car stopped in front of a large, crumbling house at the end of the road. The windows were dark, and the air around it seemed thick with an unnatural stillness. "This is your stop," the driver said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. Emily shook her head, her hands trembling. "This isn't my home. I don't live here." The driver turned to face her, and for the first time, she could see his eyes behind the dark glasses. Cold, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "This is where you died," he said, his words chilling her to the bone. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling, refusing to comprehend what she had just heard. What are you talking about?" The driver simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You don't remember, do you? You've been reliving this night for years now. You never made it home." Emily felt her world tilt, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to look out the window, and for the first time, she saw the gravestone in the yard. her name etched into the cold gray stone, the date of her death exactly 1 year ago. Her entire body went numb as the realization crashed over her. She turned back to the driver, but the car was gone, vanished into the night. She stood alone in the cold, staring at her own grave, trapped in an endless cycle, doomed to take that last ride forever. Jason had been driving a cab for years, and he thought he'd seen it all. Late-night drunks, weirdos with strange requests, couples fighting in the back seat. Nothing surprised him anymore. But there was something different about tonight. The streets were unusually quiet, and an eerie fog had settled over the city, making the streetlights seem dimmer, their halos barely cutting through the mist. It was well past midnight, and Jason was about to call it a night when his rideshare app dinged. A new fare request. He sighed, glancing at the time, 2:06 a.m. It was always around this hour that the strangest passengers seemed to appear. The pickup location was only a few blocks away, at the corner of an old neighborhood. He didn't usually get many requests from that area, but money was money. He tapped to accept and began driving toward the destination, his headlights barely illuminating the foggy road ahead. As Jason pulled up to the corner, he saw a man standing under a flickering street lamp. The man was tall and thin, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed to blend into the shadows. His head was slightly lowered, and his face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat. Jason rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" The man nodded slowly and stepped forward, his movements deliberate and stiff, like he hadn't moved in years. He opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word, his coat rustling against the leather. "Where to?" Jason asked, turning his head slightly to glance at the rearview mirror. But the man didn't look up. He simply pulled a small piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it over the seat. Jason took the note, frowning as he unfolded it. The note read, 32 Redwood Avenue. Jason didn't recognize the address, but that wasn't unusual. "Got it," he said, putting the car in gear and driving off into the night. The ride was silent. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional drip of rain against the windshield. Jason glanced at the rearview mirror again, but the passenger just sat there, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, his hands folded in his lap. As they drove, the streets seemed to grow darker, more desolate. The familiar cityscape faded into a maze of unfamiliar roads and overgrown trees. Jason couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. He'd driven all over the city, but he didn't remember ever coming this way. After a while, he cleared his throat, trying to break the silence. "So, what brings you out this late?" he asked. The man didn't respond. Jason sighed, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Tough night." Still no answer. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog, winding deeper into a part of the city Jason was certain didn't exist. He glanced at the GPS on his phone, but the screen was blank, as if the map couldn't register their location. He took a deep breath, trying to push down the growing knot of anxiety in his stomach. "You sure this is the right address?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The man's head lifted slightly, just enough for Jason to see his pale lips beneath the shadow of his hat. "Keep driving," the man whispered, his voice raspy and cold, like the wind itself. Jason's blood ran cold, but he nodded and kept going. The road narrowed, and the fog thickened, swirling around the car like a living thing. Redwood Avenue wasn't far now, but Jason didn't want to be here anymore. Something about the man in the backseat made his skin crawl. Finally, the car slowed to a stop in front of a house at the end of the street. The house was old and dilapidated, its windows dark and lifeless. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the entire place seemed abandoned. Jason's heart raced as he stared at the house, its presence looming in the fog like a shadow from another world. "We're here," Jason said, turning around to face the man. But when he looked back, the back seat was empty. Jason's heart leapt into his throat. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the weight shift when the man got out. He scrambled out of the driver's seat, rushing around to the back of the car, but there was no one there. The street was empty, save for the eerie fog and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Jason's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he looked up at the house. He knew he should leave, get back in the car and drive as fast as he could, but something drew him to the front door. It creaked open as he approached, revealing a dark hallway lined with dust and cobwebs. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his feet. The house smelled of damp wood and decay, and the air was thick with a sense of abandonment. As Jason moved deeper into the house, he saw old, faded photos on the walls, photos of the man who had been in his cab. The same dark coat, the same wide-brimmed hat. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He stopped in front of a large, framed newspaper clipping hanging crookedly on the wall. The headline read, "Local man found dead in cab. 10 years later, mysterious sightings continue." Jason's blood froze as he read the article. The man he had just picked up had died in a cab ride exactly 10 years ago, and he wasn't the first driver to report a strange passenger late at night, asking to be taken to Redwood Avenue. Jason backed away from the wall, his mind reeling. He ran out of the house, jumped back into his cab, and sped off into the night, his hands shaking on the wheel. But no matter how far he drove, the memory of that cold, silent passenger lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. And when he looked down at his dashboard, the gas gauge was inexplicably full. The city was bustling, even in the late hours. Liam had been a rideshare driver for about a year now, picking up all sorts of passengers throughout the day and into the night. He had grown used to the unpredictable shifts and random fares, and though he was no stranger to strange passengers, tonight had been oddly quiet. That was until he got a ping for a ride just after midnight. It was from a place called Hollowbrook, an old neighborhood on the edge of town. People avoided it, claiming it had been abandoned for years after a series of suspicious deaths in the area. It had become infamous in local urban legends, but Liam didn't believe in that kind of thing. He accepted the request and drove toward Hollowbrook. The streets became emptier as he approached the old neighborhood, the city lights fading behind him as dark, leafless trees began lining the streets. It didn't take long for Liam to feel uneasy. The houses were old and dilapidated, with boarded-up windows and overgrown yards, the kind of place you see in horror movies. Finally, he pulled up to the address, an old mansion sitting at the end of a cul-de-sac. The mansion was massive, its once grand structure now crumbling under years of neglect. Vines had overtaken the walls, and the porch sagged under the weight of decay. He didn't see anyone waiting. Liam checked the app. Customer's name, Laura. He waited a few minutes, growing impatient. "Come on, Laura," he muttered, tapping the steering wheel. The wind howled outside, sending a shiver down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, as if someone was watching him. He checked the rearview mirror, nothing but the darkness of the night behind him. Suddenly, the back door opened, and a woman slid into the seat. Liam jumped, startled by how quietly she'd approached. She was pale, her hair long and disheveled, wearing a faded dress that looked like it belonged in another era. She didn't meet his eyes, her gaze fixed on something distant, far beyond the car. "Laura?" he asked, his voice shaky. She nodded slightly, still staring ahead, her hands folded in her lap. "Drive," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely cut through the eerie silence of the car. Liam glanced at the app for the destination. Old Mill Road. It wasn't far from here, though he wasn't familiar with it. He pulled away from the mansion, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror. Laura sat completely still, her pale skin almost glowing in the faint light. Something about her unsettled him deeply, but he told himself to keep calm. It was just another late-night ride. They drove in silence, the car's engine the only sound breaking the otherwise unnatural stillness. The road became narrower as they approached the outskirts of town, winding deeper into the woods. Trees loomed on either side of the car, their twisted branches casting ominous shadows in the dim light of the headlights. As they neared Old Mill Road, the GPS on Liam's phone suddenly flickered and died. He cursed under his breath and glanced back at Laura. She still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word since she got in. "Looks like my GPS is down," he said, trying to break the silence. "Do you know where we're going?" She didn't respond at first, But after a long pause, she whispered, "Just keep going." Liam swallowed hard, his unease growing. He had never felt more alone on a drive. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, with no sign of life in sight. He reached for his phone to try and restart the GPS, but the screen remained black, completely unresponsive. "Can you tell me more about where you're going?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Laura turned her head slowly, her pale face finally coming into view in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were sunken and dark, her expression blank. "It's just up ahead," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Liam's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. Something about her words sent a chill down his spine. They were approaching an old bridge now, the kind that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Beyond it, there was nothing but dense trees and darkness. Suddenly, the car lurched as the engine sputtered and stalled. Liam's heart raced. He tried turning the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. Panic set in as he fumbled with his phone again, but the screen was still dead. The car was completely powerless. "I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong," Liam said, turning to look at Laura, but the back seat was empty. Liam blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of it. She had been right there. He had seen her just moments ago. He whipped his head around, scanning the empty road and the dark trees, but there was no sign of Laura. She was gone. He scrambled out of the car, his breath coming in short gasps as he looked around frantically. The night was still unnaturally so. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just silence. Liam felt a cold dread creep over him. He glanced at the old bridge in front of him and then back at the car. Something caught his eye, a faded signpost near the bridge. He squinted, stepping closer, and his blood ran cold as he read the words etched into the weathered wood. "In memory of Laura, 1986 to 2003. His heart stopped. That couldn't be right. Then it hit him. He had just driven a ghost. Laura had died years ago on this very road in a car accident. The dead-end fare wasn't just a route. It was her last ride, and Liam had unknowingly taken her there.